What is up, you guys? My name is Nick, and welcome to my channel where I cover all things entertainment. Whatever you're watching, I'm making videos about. And on Saturdays, I like to take a look at my favorite streaming service, Shudder, to find a solid horror movie recommendation for you guys. But as I told you last week in my Shudder starter guide, I want to do a part 2 to rank the best horror classics currently available on Shudder. So if you're new to horror, we're going to go over all the basics that'll get you inducted into the horror film fan club, but you're probably not new to horror, so let's go over some of our classic favorites that you might want to revisit heading into Halloween season. Number 13 is Hellraiser, Clive Barker's iconic adaptation of his own work that introduced the world to Pinhead. In this supernatural fantasy horror, Kirsty is a young woman moving into a new home with her father and stepmother Julia. Turns out Julia is the wicked stepmother of all horror because she was having an affair with her husband's brother Frank, and he returns to her life as a zombified version of himself living in the attic, and he needs blood to survive. Julia begins luring men to the house to murder them and feed them to Frank. I don't want to say a whole lot more about this movie for anyone who hasn't seen it already, but you know Pinhead, his fellow Cenobites, and a mysterious puzzle box come into play, forcing Kirsty to go full final girl if she wants to make it to the sequel. And I gotta say, Hellbound Hellraiser 2 is currently on Shudder, and that is my preferred Hellraiser movie.
We'll tear your soul apart.
Number 12 is The Changeling, a haunted house thriller about a man played by George C. Scott who moves into an old mansion only to find that it is haunted by the spirit of a little boy. But that's only the beginning of the disturbing secrets uncovered in this house. I'll admit it took me a few watches to actually get into this one. Shout out to Aunt Anise for recommending this one to me as a kid, as all the best aunts do. But Shudder puts it best. This is simply one of the best ghost stories ever made. Number 11 is The Beyond, widely considered to be Lucio Fulci's masterpiece. This bizarre film follows a woman who inherits a hotel in Louisiana that is built on an entrance to hell. Gorehounds should love this one because it is one sequence after another of gory practical effects. It is a different spin on the zombie film, and that's exactly why you want to watch it.
Who else is here? There's nobody here.
Number 10 is Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, one of the most disturbing movies ever made that I actually like. Michael Rooker stars as Henry, a drifter who moves in with fellow ex-con and friend Otis, who becomes his wingman during a spree of vicious killings. This is a grounded and raw look at the behavior of serial killers as the film tries to understand and explore their psyche. This is loosely based on the real-life killings committed by Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, but it isn't a dramatization of those events. It takes inspiration from them and creates a story about what makes a killer. This movie is very controversial for many reasons. It took years to get released actually because it was considered to be too graphic, but I personally think that this movie uses violence in the right way and that it properly grabs your attention, but it doesn't just try to make your stomach churn for the sake of it. There's purpose here. Henry should come with all of the trigger warnings, but I'd also argue that it needs to be seen. And if this is your type of movie, if you do like this, you might want to check out Angst, which is also on Shudder.
What do you say, Otis? You want to go grab a beer?
Number 9 is The House of the Devil, an 80s throwback babysitter horror from director Ty West that stars Jocelyn Donahue as a down-on-her-luck college student who desperately needs the funds to get out of the dorms and get into her dream home. She takes a job babysitting for a couple who lives in a creepy old house in the middle of nowhere, but when she arrives for the job, she learns that things aren't exactly what she signed up for. I'm gonna leave it at that because I don't want to spoil anything. This is a slow burn film, but definitely stick with it because it leads to one hell of an explosive ending.
I'm calling in regards to the babysitter flyer posted outside my dorm.
Number 8 is Old Boy. This South Korean revenge epic from Park Chan-wook is about a man who is kidnapped after a drunken night out and held prisoner in a room for 15 years. When he is suddenly released, the man goes on a mission to find out who did this to him and why. This might not sound like much of a horror movie to you, but this revenge thriller features Tarantino levels of movie violence, and there are twists and turns that take us into very disturbing territory, so watch out because Old Boy will mess you up. Number 7 is Return of the Living Dead, one of my favorite 80s horror movies, next to another entry later on in this list, but this horror comedy follows two workers at a medical supply facility who unwittingly release a toxin into the air that brings the dead back to life. The punk rockers partying next door in the cemetery must face off against a horde of zombies hungry for human brains. This movie is cheesy, gory, and funny, and it's one that I love to revisit regularly because it's the type of horror comedy that actually works for me.
Send more cops.
Number 6 is Halloween, the slasher classic that needs no introduction, but I'll give it one anyway. Serial killer Michael Myers breaks out of a mental facility and heads to his home in the Midwest where he killed his sister years earlier. A group of babysitters are stalked and terrorized as the white-masked, knife-wielding boogeyman targets them one by one. I'll admit Halloween isn't my number one favorite. I know a lot of people would have this at the top of this list, but I've grown to appreciate and love this movie in my own way. But I just have to note that I think it's a pretty big deal that this movie is currently streaming on Shudder. It could be gone by October because that's how these things go, but they also have sequels Halloween 4 and 5 if you want to watch those as well.
Halloween, the night he came home.
Number 5 is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now we're just talking about classics. Let's speed through this. A group of friends head out to a cemetery to check on a relative's grave after reports of grave robbings. While they're in the area, they decide to stop at the countryside family home, and as they wander around the property, they are lured one by one to a neighbor's house where a family of cannibals live, including the chainsaw-wielding icon Leatherface. What is there to say about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? It's perfect, I love it, and I can't wait to talk about it more in the future.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. After you stop screaming, you'll start talking about it.
Number 4 is Phantasm. This sci-fi fantasy horror is about a young boy named Mike who has recently lost both of his parents, so he's living with his older brother. And as he's hanging around the local funeral home being a weirdo, he notices the mortician, the tall man, removes a casket and carries it away for himself. Mike continues to investigate and discovers horrifying secrets held within the walls of the funeral home. This movie plays out like a nightmare, which I love, and it might be low budget 70s sci-fi horror, but it is still one of the most unique classics that I wish they made more of. They don't have the sequel, the direct sequel on Shudder, but they do have 3 through 5 in case you want to dive into the rest of this franchise. Number 3 is ReAnimator. Based on a story by H.P. Lovecraft, Stuart Gordon's cult classic follows an eccentric med school student who creates a serum that brings the dead back to life. You can imagine the problems that follow. This is my other favorite 80s horror film. Pair this with Return of the Living Dead for a really fun double feature. This movie has some really poor effects. They're really cheesy, but they still work for me as a whole because overall this movie is just a bonkers fun time. It is gory and hilarious. It is raunchy and disturbing. ReAnimator is everything. I love it.
You'll never get credit for my discovery. Who's going to believe a talking head? Get a job in a sideshow.
Number 2 is Black Christmas. You might want to save this one for the holiday season, but whatever you do, this slasher classic needs to be seen. Set in a Canadian college town, an unknown murderer creeps into the attic of a sorority house and begins terrorizing the residents. First come the harassing phone calls, then one of their own goes missing, putting the women on edge as their winter break begins. I cannot believe how well this movie holds up, not just the horror, but also the humor. What makes this movie work so well, I think, is that in the beginning, it's kind of like a college teen comedy, and it's really quite funny, but the tension ratchets up until the film fully shifts into a bone-chilling horror film. I mean, the ending of this movie, it still gives me the shivers. I think it's one of the best. I did a Shudder review for this last year, but I'm gonna be talking about it forever because I absolutely love this movie. It is my number 2 favorite horror film. I mean, it's like tied for 1. I don't know, you know how we are. You gotta have like a top 5. You can't just pick like 1, but I love Black Christmas. It's so good. Be prepared to hear me talk about it because again, it's just, I'm never gonna stop. And number 1 is Night of the Living Dead. What else could it be? George A. Romero's classic birthed the zombie movie, and in it, a group of strangers board themselves up in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere and try to survive as zombies begin to walk the earth. Dwayne Jones gives an iconic performance as one of the best heroes in horror, and it's just astonishing to me how well done this movie is for such a low-budget independent feature, because every time I watch it, I swear it feels like exactly what I would want to do if I were making a zombie movie. It is so stripped down and just simple and basic, but also in the perfect way. It covers everything exactly as it should. It's like, you know, board up that window, block that door, grab that weapon. It's just how a zombie survival film should be. I'm looking at all of the movies that have followed Night of the Living Dead, and I'm like, man, nothing does it quite like the original, does it?
The killers are eating the flesh of the people they murdered.
Yeah, they're dead. They're all messed up.
All right, guys, that is part 2 of the Shudder starter guide. Pair this with part 1. It's everything you need getting into Shudder. Of course, there is a whole bunch more that I cannot wait to cover every Saturday here on Watch This Now. Thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you made it to the end of the video. You got a gold star. That's right. Like this video, share it with your friends. Let me know what your favorites are in the comments below and what you think of them. I, of course, had to sort of gloss over everyone. They all deserve their own video, and I can't wait to talk about all of these movies more in depth as we continue to build this community here. Thank you guys so much for helping pushing me over 400 subscribers. At least as of now. It could drop to 0 any moment. We know how that goes. Feel free to follow me on Instagram if you're interested. Subscribe if you're interested. Thank you so much again, you guys. That is it for this video, but I won't stop you from watching another.